snow on the windows, 3 feet of it, and climbing, burying the only road down off that mountain. Inside the big house, a fire burns low, a long table is set for a wedding supper, and a young woman in a borrowed gray dress lifts a silver spoon to stir a sick man's cup. 3 turns. She counts them. She always counts. She does not know that in 4 minutes, the man beside her will fall. Watch the table. The brother who laughs too easily, the brother with the scar who never laughs at all, and the bride from 1,000 miles away who married a stranger off the strength of 7 beautiful letters sealed shut against a winter that is about to seal her in. She hands him the cup. He drinks. Watch her face now. Watch the spoon, because the silver is already beginning to turn black, and not one soul in that room is looking down. Snow on the windows, 3 feet of it, and climbing. Inside the big house, a fire was burning low in the stone hearth, and the long table had been set for a wedding supper, and a young woman in a borrowed gray dress sat at the right hand of a man she had known for 5 days. His name was Gideon Hale. Her name, as of the day before, was Adeline Hale, and in about 4 minutes, she was going to watch him fall. She did not know that yet. She was 24 years old and 1,000 miles from the only home she had ever owned, and she was trying very hard to remember which fork was which, because a girl raised behind the counter of a small apothecary in Ohio does not grow up with 3 forks. She grows up with 1, and she washes it herself. So she watched the others. She copied their hands. And across the table, a little girl of 6 named Pearl swung her boots under her chair and stared at the meat like it had personally wronged her. The men did most of the talking, or rather one of them did. Silas, the middle brother, smooth as poured cream and twice as easy, with a laugh that filled a room and a way of looking at you that made you feel chosen. He was telling a story about a mule and a preacher, and the ranch hands were grinning, and even Mrs. Hollis, the housekeeper, who had a face like a closed door, let one corner of her mouth move. At the foot of the table sat the youngest, Eli. He did not laugh. He had a scar that ran from the corner of his eye down into his beard, pale as a wire, and he watched the room the way a dog watches a stranger's hands. He had said maybe 9 words all night. Adeline had counted. She counted things when she was frightened. It was a habit from the shop where the difference between a remedy and a poison was sometimes a single grain on a scale, and you always counted, because counting was how you stayed alive. And at the head of the table sat her husband. Gideon Hale was not a smooth man. He was a still one, big through the shoulders in a way that made the chair look temporary, with hands that had clearly broken things and built things and buried things, and a quiet on him so heavy it had its own weather. He had spoken to her 4 times that day. Each time it had been a single sentence. Each sentence had been correct and cold and over before she could answer it. He did not look like a man who had written her 7 letters. That was the thing she kept circling back to alone in the dark when the house was asleep. The letters. She had read them so many times, the creases had gone soft as cloth. They were warm. They were funny. There was a line in the 3rd one about how the mountains in winter looked like God had pulled a clean sheet over a tired world, and she had pressed that line to her chest like a hand to a wound. The man at the head of the table had never said a warm thing in his life. You could tell. It was in the set of his jaw. So who wrote the letters? She pushed the thought down. Brides do not interrogate their wedding suppers. She lifted the small silver spoon from beside her plate, her one true possession in all the world, her mother's christening spoon worn thin at the bowl, and she reached for the cup at Gideon's place. The tonic the doctor had left because he had not touched it, because he never touched it on his own. And a wife reminds her husband to take his medicine. That is a wife's job. She had read that somewhere too. She stirred the cloudy tonic with her mother's spoon. 3 turns. She counted them. She handed him the cup. He drank. And 4 minutes later, between one breath and the next, Gideon Hale's face went the color of tallow. His eyes rolled white, and he came down out of his chair like a felled tree, taking 2 plates and a candlestick with him, and the whole long table surged up in a clatter of falling chairs and a woman's scream that turned out to be her own. Pearl shrieked. Mrs. Hollis dropped the gravy. Silas was already on his knees beside his brother, shouting his name. And the ranch hands were a wall of backs, and somebody was yelling for Doc Pruitt, who was 3 hard hours of riding away through a closing storm, and somebody else was yelling to get the master to his bed, and in all that noise and all that terror, Adeline stood frozen with her empty hand still out, still curled around the shape of a cup that wasn't there. And she looked down. Her mother's spoon lay in the spilled tonic on the white cloth, and the silver had gone black, black as a stove lid. Black the way silver goes when something is wrong with it, something she had seen exactly once before behind the counter when a man came in asking about rats. She did not have the word yet. The word would come later in the cold, in the dark, when it could do the most damage. But her body knew before her mind did. Her body went still and clever and afraid. And not one person in that screaming room was looking at the spoon. They were looking at her. Now, before we go on, before the snow and the secret and the long, hard winter that is coming for these people, you should understand how a girl gets to a table like that, in a dress that isn't hers, married to a stranger with a poison she can't yet name, turning black under her hand. Because it did not start with the wedding. It started with a grave, and a debt, and an advertisement in the back of a Cincinnati paper printed so small, she had to take it to the window to read it. So let me take you back 5 days, and then a little further. The town was called Harkness, Ohio, and it was the kind of town that took everything from you slowly and called it weather. Adeline Whitfield had buried her father in the spring. He had been a good man, and a careful one. 30 years behind the counter of Whitfield's apothecary, weighing out headache powders and cough syrups and the small daily mercies of a small town, and he had taught his only daughter everything. How to read a label and read a patient. How tincture of opium could ease a dying woman and end a healthy one, and how the only difference was the number, always the number. How to test, how to taste, how to never ever trust your eyes alone because the eye is a liar and the scale is not. What he had not taught her was how to keep the shop after he was gone, because the law in Ohio in the year 1884 did not much care what a woman knew. It cared whose name was on the deed. The name on the deed was a man called Broonmark, who held her father's note and who arrived 2 weeks after the funeral with a clean collar and a kind voice and a sum of money owed that Adeline had not known existed. $400, borrowed against the shop in the last bad year when her mother was dying upstairs and the medicine that might have helped cost more than they had. $400. She did the figures by candle for a week. There was no arrangement of the figures that worked. And there was Pearl. Pearl was 6. Pearl was not Adeline's daughter. Pearl was her sister, born late and small and motherless, the last gift and the last grief their mother left behind. And when their father died, Pearl became Adeline's in every way that mattered, and none of the ways that paid. A grown woman alone could find work. A grown woman alone with a child and no husband found doors that did not open and rooms she was not let into and a particular look from particular wives. So when the shop was sold out from under her and the rooms above it with it, and Broonmark stood in the empty doorway counting his own money, Adeline took Pearl by the hand and she walked to the rail station with everything they owned in 2 carpet bags, and she did not cry where the child could see, because that was a thing their mother had taught her without ever saying it. She had $11. She had a sister. She had her mother's spoon. And in the back of a borrowed newspaper in print, so small it hid there was a column of advertisements that the women in town spoke of, the way they spoke of disease, matrimonial notices. Men out west in the territories in the high, lonesome country, where there were 10 of them for every woman riding east for wives. Most of them she could not have stomached. She read them all anyway by the window in the cold after Pearl was asleep in the station house. And then there was one. It did not list a fortune. It did not list demands. It said in plain words that a man in the Montana Territory had a homestead and cattle and timber, that he was 31 years of age and in good health, that he could offer a hard life in a beautiful place and an honest name, and that he would welcome a woman of sense, and that he understood a woman might come with a child, and that a child would be no burden, but a gift. She read that last line 4 times. A child would be no burden, but a gift. She wrote that night. She did not know she was writing to her future. She thought she was buying time. The letters came back faster than she expected, and warmer. They were beautiful. That is the only honest word for it. Whoever held that pen had a soul in him somewhere. He wrote about the seasons and the silence and a dog he'd had as a boy. He wrote that he did not expect love, that he would not press her, that she and the child would have their own room and their own door with a lock on it, and that she could set the pace of everything, every single thing. And he meant it. She could feel that he meant it the way you can feel warmth through a wall. He wrote that he was not a man of many words out loud, that the words came easier on paper. And would she forgive him that? She forgave him that. She forgave him everything. By the 4th letter, she had built a man in her mind, plank by plank, the way he built his house, and she had half fallen for a thing made of ink. So she said yes. So she spent 8 of her $11 and a loan from a kind stationmaster's wife on 2 tickets west, and she put Pearl on the Northern Pacific with her hair braided tight, and she watched Ohio peel away behind them like old wallpaper, and somewhere across the endless brown of the Dakotas she let herself for the first time in a year imagine being all right. She should have known better. A girl raised on poisons should always know better. The sweetest thing on the shelf is the one you check twice. The railroad ended and the stage began, and the stage was the last one before the passes closed. The driver told her so. Twice told her like a warning. He was tired of giving. They climbed for 2 days into country that got bigger and wider and more silent the higher it went, until the trees stood black against the snow like stitches in a wound. And Pearl stopped asking questions and just held her sleeve. It was the driver who first said the name that mattered. He was a talker the way lonely men are, and somewhere on the 2nd day, he jerked his chin at a far ridge and said that was Hale Land, starting all of it as far as she could see, and a good ways past. All of it, Adeline said. All of it, the driver said. Old Jedediah Hale carved it out of nothing 40 years back. Cattle and a sawmill and timber a railroad would kill for. 3 sons. And where is the old man now? She asked, only to be polite, only because the cold made talking better than not talking. The driver was quiet a moment. The reins creaked. Dead, he said. Last winter. Wasting sickness, they say. Went thin as a rail over a few months, and then went. Shame. Hard man, but fair. They buried him up on the hill before the ground froze too deep to dig. Wasting sickness, Adeline said. That's what they say. The driver said again, and something in the way he said it, the small, careful flatness of it, sat down in her chest and did not leave. She did not know why. She filed it. She was good at filing things. It is another thing you learn behind a counter, that a fact you cannot use today may be the only fact that saves you on a day you cannot yet see. Then the stage came around a shoulder of the mountain, and the Hale homestead opened up below them in the blue evening. And despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the dead man on the hill, Adeline's breath caught. It was beautiful. The letters had not lied about that. A long, low house of pale stone and dark timber smoke rising straight up in the windless, cold lamplight, in the windows gone gold, and barns and corrals, and the great black mountains standing guard all around it like the walls of a church. Snow lay over all of it, clean and deep and untouched, and it looked exactly as the 3rd letter had promised, like God had pulled a sheet over a tired world. I am home, she thought. She was wrong about that too, but not in the way she feared. They came out onto the porch to meet the stage, the 3 of them, and that was the first crack in the world she had built out of ink. because the man who stepped down first fast and warm with both hands out was beautiful in the easy way, fair-haired and laughing, and her heart leapt up to meet him, because surely this was the man of the letters, this was the soul she had fallen for. It was not. "I'm Silas," he said, and his grin was the warmest thing in 100 miles of snow. "Silas Hale, you must be half froze. Lord, look at the little one. Come in, both of you, before the cold takes your ears off." And behind him, not moving, not smiling, stood a man a full head taller and 10 years older, in the eyes broad and dark and still as the mountain itself, and Adeline knew with a sinking certainty, before anyone said a word, that the still one was hers. Gideon said Silas with a wave of his hand. "My brother, well, yours." Gideon Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pearl longer. Then he said, "You'll be cold," and turned and went inside, and that was all. That was the whole of her welcome from the man whose words she had pressed to her chest like a wound. She stood on the porch with the wind cutting through the borrowed coat, and she felt something fold up quietly inside her and put itself away. "He's not much for talk," Silas said, gently watching her face. "Don't take it hard. He feels things. He just keeps them where you can't see." The words came easier on paper, she thought. Would she forgive him that? And the third brother came forward, then the youngest, the scarred one, and he took her carpet bags out of her hands without being asked, and without a word, and when she looked up to thank him, she found him already looking at her hard, searching the way you look at a stranger who has come to a place where a man recently died. "This is Eli," Silas said. "He talks even less than Gideon. We're a regular festival, the Hales." Eli held her gaze a second longer than was comfortable. Then he looked down at Pearl, and something in the scarred face eased just barely, and he crouched and held out one big rough hand to the child. "It's warm inside," he said. First thing he'd said, low and rough as gravel. "There's a cat." Pearl, who had not let go of Adeline's sleeve in 2 days, considered this gravely. Then she put her small hand in his enormous one and let him lead her toward the door. And Adeline, watching her sister walk trustingly into that strange, warm house on the hand of a silent, scarred man whose father had died of a thing the driver could not quite say. Out loud felt the fear come back sharper now, and with it a single clear thought she could not have explained. Something is wrong in this house. She did not yet know it would take her all winter and nearly her life to learn how wrong. She only knew the way her father had taught her to know the way you know a tincture has turned before you can say how. She followed her sister inside. The house, at least, did not lie. It was warm and clean and full of books, which she had not expected, shelves of them worn and read again, and she thought someone here has a mind. And she let herself hope for one foolish minute that it was the tall, dark man, that the letters were true after all, and only his tongue had failed him. Mrs. Hollis showed them to their room. It was a good room. There was a fire laid, and a real bed, and a smaller bed for Pearl, and on the door, exactly as the letters had promised, there was a lock. She put her hand on the lock, and she did not know whether to laugh or weep. "You'll take your meals with the family," Mrs. Hollis said. Her voice was flat, and her eyes missed nothing. "The wedding's set for 3 days hence. The circuit preacher comes through on the 15th. Mr. Hale arranged it," which Mr. Hale Adeline almost asked, but she didn't. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hollis said, and left. That night, with Pearl asleep and the wind walking around the house like a thing alive, Adeline took out the 7 letters and read them again by the firelight, all of them in order, looking for the man she had met in any line of them. She did not find him. She found someone, though, someone warm and quick and clever, someone who joked and dreamed and noticed things, and she sat very still for a long time holding the paper, because that someone existed, she had not imagined him. The letters were real, the warmth was real, it just did not live in Gideon Hale. So who, she thought again, who in this house holds a pen like that? And the fire popped, and the wind leaned on the glass, and high up on the hill, under the snow, a dead man kept his secret, and downstairs somewhere a clock she could not see ticked toward a wedding she could not stop, and a winter that would bury the road behind her. She did not sleep much. She blamed the cold. The next 3 days taught her the shape of the place and the shape of the people, and she learned them the only way she knew how, which was by watching and counting and keeping still. She learned that Gideon Hale rose before light and worked past dark and ate like a man refueling a machine fast and joyless, and that the hands did not fear him, but something better. They respected him. They watched his hands when he spoke and did the thing before he finished asking. She learned he had a way of standing in a doorway that filled it. She learned that he was in fact sick, though no one used the word. She saw it on the second morning. He came in from the cold gray and sweating, and his hand shook, lifting the coffee just a tremor there and gone. And he set the cup down too hard and gripped the table edge for the space of a breath. And his face, when he thought no one was looking, was the face of a man fighting his own body for the right to stand up. Then Silas was there, easy and laughing, a hand on the broad shoulder, asking, was it the stomach again, telling him he worked too hard, telling him to take the tonic Doc Pruitt left, and Gideon shook him off, the way a tired bear shakes off a fly, and said it was nothing, just the winter. It always took him hard. Always, Adeline thought, so this is not new. How long? She filed it. She learned that Silas ran the books. That was his whole work, and he was good at it. The ledgers and the contracts and the railroad men who came up the road with offers for the timber. He had the soft hands of a man who worked indoors and the bright tongue of a man who worked on people, and he was kind to Adeline, genuinely kind. The only one who made her laugh, the only one who treated her arrival like a gift and not a problem. She was grateful to him. She would remember being grateful to him later, and the memory would taste like ash. She learned that Eli was a mystery. He worked harder than any hired man and spoke less than any, and he had been to the war, or to some war. You could see it in the way he sat with his back to walls, and the hands gave him a wide and wary berth. But he was good to Pearl. He found the child, the cat, an enormous gray tom named General, and he whittled her a little horse out of pine in 3 evenings, without a word about it. Just set it by her plate one morning and walked off, and Pearl loved him with the fierce, uncomplicated love of a child who has chosen, and Adeline did not know what to make of that, because the rest of the house watched Eli like he might go off. And a child she knew, a child can feel the truth of a person before the grown people stop being fooled by it. And she learned on the 3rd day that there was a man named Cyrus Vane. He came up the road in a fine sleigh with 2 outriders, and the whole yard went tight when he arrived, the hands going quiet, Mrs. Hollis pressing her lips, and Adeline watching from the window, with Pearl felt the temperature of the house drop 10 degrees, though the fire still roared. Vane was a soft, heavy man in expensive wool with rings on his fingers and a smile that never reached above his nose. He owned the bank in the valley town and the freight line and the newspaper and a good deal of the law, and he had wanted the Hale timber for 10 years, the way some men want a woman who has refused them, which is to say, not for the having, but for the winning. He came into the front room without being asked, and he sat without being offered. And he laid a leather folder on the table, and he said, in a voice like warm oil, that he had come to pay his respects to the bride, and to make one more time in a spirit of neighborly goodwill. A very generous offer. Gideon stood by the cold window with his arms crossed, and let him talk. The land's not for sale, Gideon said when Vane finally stopped. Same as last year, same as the year before. Things change, Cyrus Vane said pleasantly. Men's circumstances change. A man takes on a wife, a child. A man's been poorly this winter, I hear. Folks worry. A man should think about what becomes of his people if the Lord calls him sudden the way the Lord called your father. The room went very quiet. Adeline, by the door, stopped breathing. Gideon turned from the window, then slow, and looked at Cyrus Vane, and there was nothing cold in his face now. There was a furnace in it. And when he spoke, his voice was so low and so level, it raised the hair on her arms. "Say my father's name in this house again," Gideon said. "Go on. Say it." Cyrus Vane smiled and gathered his folder and did not say it. "He's a proud man," your husband Vane said to Adeline on his way out, tipping his hat, his pale eyes crawling over her like a hand. "Pride's an expensive thing to keep this far from anywhere. You seem a sensible girl. I do hope you'll be a settling influence." Then he was gone in a jingle of harness, and the house breathed again, and Adeline stood holding the door frame with her heart going hard. "A man's been poorly this winter, I hear. The way the Lord called your father." She looked across the room at Gideon, who had turned back to the window, his big shoulders rigid, fighting the tremor in his hand where he thought no one could see. And the filing in her mind, the careful, instinctive sorting her father had drilled into her, began very quietly against her will to move two facts toward each other. A father dead last winter. Wasting. A son this winter. Poorly. She made herself stop. She was a frightened stranger inventing horrors. Men got sick in the cold. Old men died. That was the world. To think anything else was madness. And worse than madness, it was the kind of thought that got a newcomer thrown out into the snow. She made herself stop, but she did not unfile it. The day before the wedding, she did the thing that changed how Gideon Hale looked at her, though neither of them understood it as that at the time. A hand named Tom Reedy tore his arm open on a barbed wire fence, badly a long ragged gash that bled through his coat and through the cloth they wrapped it in, and the nearest doctor was 3 frozen hours away, and the men stood around him in the barn, making the helpless noises men make. Adeline was crossing the yard with Pearl. She heard the commotion. She did not think. 30 years of her father's counter took her feet into that barn before her fear could stop them. "Let me see it," she said. The men looked at her like a hen had spoken. She did not wait for permission. She had stopped waiting for permission somewhere back in Ohio. She knelt in the bloody straw, and she took Tom Reedy's arm in her 2 hands, firm and calm, and she looked at the wound, the way her father had taught her. Not at the blood. The blood is a liar at the wound. And she said, "Clean water, hot, and the cleanest cloth in this house, and whiskey, and a needle and thread from Mrs. Hollis, and somebody hold his other hand, and somebody talk to him about something that isn't this." And they did it, because she said it the way Gideon said things like, "The thing was already done." She cleaned it, and she closed it 16 stitches small, and even her hand steady as a clock, and she packed it with a poultice she made on the spot from the contents of her own carpet bag, because she had brought her father's herbs across a continent, the way other women brought wedding china, and she bound it tight. And she told Tom Reedy he would keep the arm, and he would curse her for the soreness in a week, and bless her for the arm in a month. And Tom Reedy Gray, and sweating, laughed once weekly, and called her ma'am. She stood up with blood to her elbows, and Gideon Hale was standing in the barn door. She had not heard him come. He filled the doorway snow on his shoulders, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him, yet had not seen on him once in 3 days, and it took her a moment to name it, because it was so unlike the cold and the stillness. He was looking at her like he was seeing her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Quiet, but not cold now. Not cold at all." "My father," she said. "He kept the apothecary in our town. 30 years. He taught me everything he knew, everything Gideon said, everything she said." He looked at her a moment longer. Something moved behind his eyes, some calculation, some slow turning of a key. Then he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield." And it was the first whole sentence he had given her that had any warmth in it. And it was not even her name yet. It was still her father's name. But she heard the warmth, and despite herself, despite everything, despite the cold dread climbing in her about the man and his father, something in her chest opened a half-inch toward him. "You're a fool," she told herself that night watching the fire. "You came here for a roof and a name for Pearl. That is all. Do not start building a man out of one kind. Look the way you built one out of ink. You did that once. Look where it landed you." but she fell asleep that night easier than she had since Ohio. The wedding was small. The circuit preacher came up the road on the morning of the 15th, a tired old man on a tired old mule, and he married them in the front room with the books all around, and a fire going and snow against every window. And there were maybe 20 people, the Hands and Mrs. Hollis and Silas grinning in the front like it was the best day of his own life, and Eli in the back by the wall where he always stood, and Pearl in a clean pinafore holding the little pine horse. Adeline wore the gray dress Mrs. Hollis lent her because her own had not survived the road and she carried nothing. And when the old preacher asked, did she take this man? She looked up into Gideon Hale's still dark face, and she saw for just a flicker that he was as frightened as she was. This enormous, silent man frightened, and that undid something in her, and she said, I do, in a voice that did not shake. And when the preacher said Gideon could kiss his bride, Gideon hesitated in front of everyone. He looked at her asking, and she understood that he was honoring the promise from the letters. The promise that she set the pace, even now, even here. And so, she was the one who closed the small distance and turned her cheek to him, and he kissed her cheek once gently, and his beard was rough, and his hand at her waist was careful, as if she were made of something breakable. And it was over, and it was nothing, and it was everything, and the room cheered, and Pearl clapped, and Adeline Whitfield became Adeline Hale, with snow falling outside, and dread sitting quiet in the bottom of her heart like a stone in a clear pool. The wedding night they did not share. He carried her 2 carpet bags up himself, which surprised her, and he set them inside the good room with the lock on the door, and he stood in the hall a moment too big for it, looking at his boots. I meant what I wrote, he said. Whoever wrote it, she thought, but she said nothing. About the pace, about the lock. He nodded at the door. That's yours. I won't ever try it. You have my word, and my word's the only thing I've got that's never failed me. Thank you, she said. There's a room at the end of the hall, he said. That's mine. If the child takes fright in the night, in a new place, she knows where I am. And then he did the thing she would remember on the worst night of the winter, the thing that told her the man of the letters and the man on the stairs might be reachable to one another after all. He crouched down to Pearl, who was hovering sleepy in the doorway, and he held out his big scarred hand, palm up, and he said, This is your house now. Every room of it but 2. The powder room off the kitchen, because there's lye and such in there that'd burn you. And the room where the medicines are kept, the cold pantry, because some of what's on those shelves looks like sugar and isn't. You stay out of those 2, and the rest is yours to run wild in. Deal. Pearl considered. She put her small hand in his huge one and shook it once, solemn as a banker. Deal, said Pearl. And Gideon Hale almost smiled and went off down the hall to his own cold room, and Adeline shut her door and turned the lock she had not asked to use and leaned her back against it and let the breath she had been holding for 3 days come out of her slow. She had a roof. She had a name for Pearl. She had a husband who kept his word and a lock she did not need. She had been wrong to be afraid, hadn't she? The house was warm. The man was decent. The dread was just the cold and the strangeness and a talkative driver's flat little voice. She believed that for 1 whole day. She believed it right up until the wedding supper. The supper was Mrs. Hollis's doing a proper one, the only celebration the season allowed, and the table was laid and the fire was high, and Silas told his story about the mule and the preacher, and the room laughed, and Adeline in the borrowed gray dress almost let herself be happy. And Gideon was worse that night. She saw it the moment she sat, grayer. The sweat at his hairline, though the fire was no hotter than usual, the careful way he moved his hands like a man carrying water in cupped palms. He ate almost nothing. He had eaten almost nothing in 3 days. She realized now that she set the days side by side. He was vanishing in front of all of them, and the whole house had agreed somehow, without ever saying so, to call it the winter. The doctor's tonic stood at his place untouched, the way it always stood, and Adeline, because she was his wife, now because a wife reminds her husband to take his medicine because she wanted God, help her to do one right thing in this strange new life, picked up her mother's silver spoon and reached for the cloudy cup and stirred it. 3 turns. She counted them. She handed it to him. He looked at her, something in his eyes, fond and tired and grateful. He drank it down to please her. And 4 minutes later, Gideon Hale fell. You know this part now. You came in on this part. The chairs going over the woman's scream, that was her own, Pearl shrieking Silas on his knees, the hands a wall of backs, the cry going up for Doc Pruitt 3 frozen hours away through a storm that had been building all day, and now as if it had only been waiting for this broke. They carried him up the stairs, 4 men, his boots dragging. They put him in his bed. Adeline followed because she did not know what else to do, and at the top of the stairs, she looked back down once at the wreck of the table, the spilled food, the fallen candle guttering on the cloth, and she saw her mother's spoon lying in the puddle of tonic, and the silver had gone black. She stood there a long moment while the house screamed below her and around her. She thought of a man in her father's shop years ago, a farmer asking quietly about something for the rats in his grain, and her father weighing out a white powder onto a square of paper, and her father's voice low only to her after the man had gone. Remember the smell of it, Addie, garlic where there's no garlic, and remember it turns good silver black. There's no honest reason for a man's silver to blacken at his own table. You see that you ask why. You hear me. You always ask why. She had smelled it. At Gideon's mouth when they lifted him, under the sweat and the sickness, garlic where there was no garlic. She had not let herself know it. She knew it now. This was not the winter. This was not a wasting sickness, the kind that had thinned a hard old man to a rail and put him under the hill last year before the ground froze. Someone in this beautiful warm house full of books and brothers and firelight was killing Gideon Hale slowly by the spoonful, the same way someone had surely killed his father, and she his bride. Of one day, the stranger, the newcomer with no friends and no name in this country, and her own apothecary's knowledge of exactly how it was done, had just stirred the poison into his cup with her own hand, in front of every soul at that table, in front of every witness who would ever be asked. Outside, the snow came down without mercy, and somewhere below the house, the road was already going the safe way down to the valley, and the law and the world packing shut under 3 feet of white, and climbing, sealing them all in together until the spring thaw. The dying man and the silent brothers, and the smiling one and the little girl who trusted them, and the woman who had just understood far too late exactly what kind of house she had married into. Pearl tugged her sleeve, pale, frightened. "Is Mr. Gideon going to die?" she whispered. And Adeline Hale looked down at her sister, and then down the dark hall at the room where her husband lay, gray and shaking and poisoned. And she made in that one cold breath the only decision a woman like her could ever have made. "No," she said, "not while I'm here." She did not yet know who. She did not yet know how to prove it. She knew only that the road was going, and the law was a season away, and that she held in her own 2 hands the one thing in this house that could save him or hang her, the truth, and a black spoon, and a winter long enough to die in. Why would good silver blacken in a sick man's cup? And why in a house full of people who loved him did not one of them want to ask? She was going to ask. And before the snow let go of that valley, the asking would cost her nearly everything. The first night she did not sleep at all. She sat in a hard chair by Gideon Hale's bed with a lamp turned low, and her mother's spoon in her apron pocket, blackened, wrapped in a square of clean cloth, because it was evidence now of what she could not yet say, to whom there was no one to say it. The storm hammered the house all night. Doc Pruitt did not come, could not come. No man living could ride that pass in that wind, and so it was Adeline alone in the lamplight, with a dying man and a secret, and she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was watch and count and think. He was bad, worse than she had let herself see at the table. Now by lamplight, with his shirt open at the throat and the fever sweat on him, she could read him like one of her father's casebooks, and what she read frightened her. The thinness. She had thought him lean. He was not lean. He was being eaten. Under the big frame, the flesh had gone. You could see it now at the collarbone and the wrist, and she thought of the driver's flat voice went thin as a rail over a few months. And she thought, no, not the same. Not the father's slow death. This was faster. This was being pushed. The hands. She lifted one, studied the nails by the lamp, and there, across each nail, a pale ridge, a little white line running side to side, the kind of line her father had shown her once in a book and called a sign, a milestone. He said the body keeps a calendar of its poisoning and writes it in the nails, and you can read the weeks in it, like rings in a stump. She counted the lines, counted the weeks. He had been dying since before her first letter, which meant the man who held that warm, clever pen, the man who wrote her about clean sheets and tired worlds, had written those letters with a poison already working in his blood, whoever he was. And there it was, again, the question that would not lie down, because the man in this bed could not write a line to save his life. She knew that now. She had heard him try to speak whole sentences and watch them die in his mouth. So, who? Stop, she told herself, one horror at a time. The letters can wait. The man cannot. She wet a cloth and cooled his face. She got water into him, a sip at a time. Clean water she drew herself from the kitchen barrel, not the tonic, never the tonic. The tonic stood on the side table where Mrs. Hollis had set the spare bottle, and Adeline looked at it the way you look at a coiled thing in the grass. Toward dawn he surfaced. His eyes opened, found the lamp, found her. You stayed, he said. Barely a voice. Where would I go? She said. The road's gone. A long pause, his eyes moving over her face. Before that, he said, at the table, you went white. Before anyone. You saw something. And Adeline Hale, who had been lied to her whole life by men with money, made a decision about this one man in the space of a breath. She did not know yet that she could trust him. She only knew that a man fighting for his life deserved to know there was a fight. You're not sick, she said. Quiet. Someone is making you sick. His eyes did not widen. That was the thing. A guilty man, a man who half suspected, would have asked, how would have asked, who would have done something with his face? Gideon Hale only looked at her steady, terrible, and she understood that some part of him had already known, had known for weeks, in the animal back of the mind where a man knows a thing he cannot afford to say out loud. How long have you thought it? She whispered. Since the third bottle, he said, since I poured a dose in the yard for a sick dog, and the dog wouldn't touch it. A dog won't, she thought. A dog is honest. It was the men who couldn't see it. We tell no one, he said. His hand found her wrist, weak, but the grip was iron. Not Pruitt, not the family, no one. They're your brothers, she said. His jaw worked. The fever made his eyes bright. One of them, he said, set a folder in front of Cyrus Vane's lawyer last fall to sell the South Timber. I found the copy. He told me it was a feed contract. I let him think I believed it. The room tilted very slightly around Adeline. Which brother, she said, but his eyes had already closed again, the strength gone out of him all at once the way it does, and he was under breathing shallow and fast, and she sat holding his wrist in the gray dawn light with a new fact filed and burning. One of the brothers had lied to him about selling the land to Cyrus Vane, and one of the brothers was killing him. She did not let herself believe they were the same brother. Not yet. A woman who jumps to the end of the sum makes errors. Her father taught her that. You check every figure. You check it twice. You do not decide the answer and then bend the numbers to meet it, because that is how the innocent hang and the guilty go free. So she would check. All winter if she had to. She had nothing else to do. The road was gone. Doc Pruitt came on the third day when the storm broke long enough for one mad, hard ride. He was a good man and a tired one, a frontier doctor who had set 10,000 bones and birthed a county and watched more people die than he could carry. And he came in stamping snow and smelling of cold and horse, and he examined Gideon with rough kindness, and he straightened up at last and rubbed his face and said the word that Adeline had been dreading and waiting for in equal measure. Wasting, Doc Pruitt said. Same as took the old man, it runs in some blood. The stomach turns on itself, the flesh goes. I've seen it a dozen times, and I've never once stopped it. He's not wasting. Adeline did not say, because Gideon's hand, hidden under the quilt, had found the edge of her apron and tugged it once. We tell no one. So she stood there, and she said nothing. And she let the good, tired doctor be wrong, and it was the hardest silence of her life. Harder than the funeral, harder than the empty shop, because she knew the way a person knows their own name, and she had to stand in a sick room and watch a learned man write the wrong word on the chart and prescribe the very thing that was doing the killing. Keep up the tonic, Doc Pruitt said, packing his bag. It won't cure him, but it'll ease him at the end. Laudanum if the pain gets bad, keep him warm, keep him fed if he'll eat. He looked at Adeline then, and his eyes were kind, and that was almost the worst part. You're new to this country, Mrs. Hale, he said, and new to this family. And I'm sorry your marriage is going to start with a grave. He'll likely not see the thaw. A man this far gone. You should prepare the child. He'll see the thaw, Adeline said. It came out before she could stop it. Quiet, but it came out. Doc Pruitt looked at her a moment the way you look at a young widow who hasn't accepted it yet, gently, pityingly. Hope's a fine thing, he said, and went out into the cold and rode away down toward the buried valley. And that was the law and the medicine of that country, gone over the White Ridge. And the house closed around her again, sealed in just the dying man and the brothers and the snow. She started that night. She could not announce it. She could not say, I believe one of you is a murderer, kindly step forward. She had no power in that house. She was a stranger and a woman and a bride of 3 days married to a man everyone expected to bury. One wrong word and she was a hysteric. Or worse, she was the obvious suspect, the newcomer who married a sick rich man and stood to gain by his death. She understood that danger from the first hour. She understood it better than she wished to, because she had stirred the cup in front of everyone. So she would be quiet, and she would be patient, and she would do the 2 things her father had taught her could not fail. She would observe, and she would test. The testing first. Because it was simple, and because a fact you can hold is worth 100 you only fear. She needed to know it was arsenic and not the wasting. She was nearly sure. The garlic, the silver, the nails, the speed. But nearly sure is not sure, and her father's voice would not let her hang a man on nearly. There was a way. An old way from the back of one of her father's books, a chemist's trick, older than she was. You took a sample, a bit of the tonic, and you needed only a few honest things. A kitchen had a clean flame, a strip of bright copper, and a steady hand. And if the poison was there, the copper would tell you it would go dull and gray as a dead man's face silvered with the very thing that should not be there. She had no copper, bright enough. Except there was a copper kettle in the kitchen, old, but the bottom of it, where the polishing cloth went, was bright as a new penny. She waited 2 nights. She learned the house's sleep. She learned that Mrs. Hollis snored, and that Eli rose twice in the night and walked the halls like a sentry, and she would have to mind him, and that Silas slept the deep, easy sleep of a man with nothing on his conscience, which she filed and did not know yet how to read. On the 3rd night, she went down to the dark kitchen in her stocking feet with a thimble of the tonic and a knife. And she cut a bright curl of copper from the bottom of the kettle, and she did the old chemist's trick by the banked coals with her heart in her throat, and she watched the bright copper go dull, go gray, go dead. There it was, out of the realm of fear and into the realm of fact. Arsenic. She sat back on her heels in the dark kitchen, and she found she was shaking not from fear now, but from the cold, clean fury of certainty, because there is a particular rage that comes to a healer who learns that the medicine is the murder, that the cup the family pressed on the dying man with love in their faces was the hand around his throat. The tonic was the delivery. She was sure of it now. Not the food was shared. The whole table ate the food. The tonic was his alone. Someone had only to tip a few grains into a bottle nobody else would ever drink, which narrowed it. Who handled the tonic? Doc Pruitt left it. But Doc Pruitt came twice a winter, and the poisoning was steady, weekly patient. So, not Pruitt. Mrs. Hollis kept the kitchen and the medicines. She filed Mrs. Hollis. Silas fetched the doctor, fussed over the dosing, was forever pressing the cup on his brother with a worried, tender hand. She filed Silas, and hated herself for it, because Silas was the only one who was kind to her. Eli walked the halls at night near the cold pantry where the bottles were kept and watched everyone with those hard, searching eyes, and had been to a war that taught a man how to kill quiet. She filed Eli, and her whole soul leaned toward him as the answer, because he was the frightening one, because it would be easy, because the mind wants the monster to look like a monster. Check every figure said her father dead in the ground in Ohio, twice. It was her own trunk that taught her the rest. She went to it the night after the copper told her true kneeling in the dark of the locked room, while Pearl slept because she needed her father's kit, the dried herbs she had carried across a whole country, the little corked bottles, the only medicine in that house she would trust, because it was the only medicine her own two hands had packed. She lifted the top tray. She felt down along the bottom of the trunk, under the spare apron, and the folded letters, and the tintype of her parents. And her fingers closed on a thing she had never put there. A twist of paper, small, folded the way her father folded a dose, pushed down into the far corner of her own trunk, under her own things, exactly where a searching hand would find it the first moment anyone thought to look. She unfolded it by the banked coals with her heart gone slow and loud in her ears. White powder, a spoonful near enough. She did not need the copper this time. She knew the weight of it now. She knew the faint and terrible smell of it. Arsenic. In her trunk. In her keeping. And Adeline knelt there in the dark and felt the floor of the world go out from under her, because she understood all at once and all the way down the true shape of the thing she was caught inside. It was not only that someone was killing Gideon Hale, it was that someone meant her to hang for it. She made herself breathe. She made herself count and set the figures in a row the way her father had drilled into her even now, even with her hands shaking in the cold. A rich man wasting away in a single winter. A new wife, a stranger, a girl come 1,000 miles from nowhere with no people behind her. A wife the whole table had watched stir his cup at the wedding supper. A wife who would inherit the day he died. And now a paper of poison tucked in that wife's own trunk, waiting. It was perfect. That was the horror of it. It was so perfect she could almost have admired it the way you admire a trap only after it has shut on your foot. When Gideon died and he was meant to die, there would be talk. There is always talk. And when the talk grew loud, someone would think to search the bride's belongings, and they would find this. And there would be no word. She could say no story she could tell that would weigh a single feather against a twist of arsenic in a stranger's own hand. She had not been brought to that mountain to be a wife. She saw it plain, now plain as the powder in the paper. She had been brought there to be blamed. The letters, she thought, and went colder still. The beautiful letters. The warm, clever soul that wrote a friendless girl about clean sheets and tired worlds. Someone had not been hunting for a wife at all. Someone had been shopping for a guilty party. And he had wanted one with no family to ask after her. No friend to swear for her nothing at her back, but a dead father and a child she would walk through fire to keep. She had answered that advertisement like a drowning woman grabbing a thrown rope. And the rope had been a noose all along. For a long moment she could not move, the poison in one hand, the sleeping child at her back. the dying man down the dark hall. And she wanted more than she had wanted anything in a year to be home behind her father's counter in Harkness with the little bell over the door and the smell of camphor in the whole plain, safe world she had lost. Then Pearl turned in her sleep and made a small, soft sound, and Adeline came back to herself. No, she thought, not the child. Whatever it costs. Not the child. She could not burn the paper. A strange fire at that hour, the smell of it, any small wrong thing, might be the very thread they hanged her with. She could not bury it in the snow, where a thaw might one day give it back. She could not be seen to do anything at all. So she did the only thing left to her. She kept it. She wrapped the twist of arsenic with the blackened spoon, the two of them together in one square of clean cloth, and she hid them deep in a pocket she sewed that same night into the lining of her own winter coat. And after that, she did not let the coat out of her reach. Evidence. 2 pieces of it now. A black spoon and a paper of death. The only true thing she owned in a house built on a lie. If they came for her, she would have it ready, not to save herself. She was long past believing anyone in that country would take a stranger's word over a dead rich man and a twist of poison, but to show Gideon if he lived, to put before whatever law the spring might finally bring. One true thing held up against the lie, and she understood kneeling there in the cold that the ground had shifted under her in the night. It was no longer only a man's life she fought for behind that locked door. It was the rope around her own neck, and the question of who would raise the child she loved on the day the trap closed, and a stranger swung for the one murder she was trying every night to stop. So she watched, all through the deep middle of that winter, while the snow piled to the windowsills and the dying man fought for every day. Adeline Hale watched the 3 brothers the way she had once watched a scale settle for the smallest tremor, the grain that tips it. And the watching taught her things. It taught her slowly the way real things are learned. It taught her that Eli, the frightening one, the one her fear had elected, brought firewood to her door each dawn without a word. That he had rigged a rope line from the house to the barn so no one would be lost in a whiteout. That when Pearl woke screaming from a nightmare in that strange house, it was Eli's door she ran to, and Eli, who walked her up and down the cold hall with the cat in her arms, and his low gravel voice telling her some long, dull story about a horse until she slept, and Eli, who carried her back, and stood a moment in Adeline's doorway, and said only, "She dreams about the funeral, the old man's. She was here for it. Saw the box." Then went back to walking the halls, the sentry, the watcher. A killer does not soothe the children, she thought, does he? Or is that exactly what a clever one does? She did not know. The not knowing was its own kind of cold, and it taught her things about Gideon, because the testing of his food and water meant she was at his side day and night. Now the only one he would take food from. Clean food she cooked herself in a small covered pot and carried up still in her hands and never once set down where another hand could reach it. And in the long lamplit hours when the fever loosened its grip, the still cold man she had married began a little at a time to come apart at the seams in front of her, and she saw what was underneath. He talked when he had the strength, not much, but each thing weighed. He talked about his father, Jedediah, a hard man who never once said a soft word and built a kingdom out of a wilderness and could not in the end say to his sons the thing they spent their lives trying to earn. Gideon had spent 30 years trying to earn it, and then the old man had wasted away last winter, thin and gray and gone, and the soft word had never come. And now Gideon said, staring at the ceiling, "Now I'm dying the same way he did. And I keep thinking, is this it? Is this the family curse? Did I earn this too?" "You earned nothing," Adeline said, fierce, surprising herself. "This was done to you. Do you hear me? You did not earn this." He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her a long time. "Why are you so sure?" he said. "Because I know what it is," she said. And she did not say the word. The road was still gone, and the family was still under the same roof, but she let him see it in her face, and he saw it, and a thing passed between them in the lamplight that had no name and needed none. He talked about being alone. He had built the whole place, he said, to need no one. A man who needs no one can't be left, can't be made a fool of, can't be hurt the way his mother was hurt dead at 30 of a hard life and a hard man. So he made himself into stone. And it worked. For years it worked. And then a stage came up the road in the blue evening, he said, with a half-woman, half-girl in a borrowed coat and a child holding her sleeve. And the woman walked into a barn and put 16 stitches in a man's arm with her hand steady as God, and the stone found out it wasn't stone after all. Found out too late. Found out dying. Adeline sat very still. I'm not good with the words he said. Out loud. They. He stopped. His jaw worked. They come out wrong, or they don't come out. I never could. My whole life. The letters she thought. The beautiful letters. For one foolish breath she let herself hope the warm soul in them was the man dying beside her. Then she put it away. She had learned already on her knees in the dark what the letters were truly for. She almost asked. The question was right there. Then his eyes closed and the strength was gone the way it always went, all at once like a candle pinched. And he was under again, breathing shallow, and the question stayed in her mouth, unasked for one more fateful week. She would wish later that she had asked it that night. It would have saved them both so much. But she didn't. And the winter ground on. The celebrated man came in the 3rd week. They had sent for him weeks ago. Mrs. Hollis told her back when Gideon first began to fail, and the family would not yet say the word aloud. Sent a rider down to the rail. Sent a telegram clear across the country to a famous physician in the East, a specialist, a man who had attended governors and railroad kings for a sum of money that made even Silas wince to write it in the book. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a great name, a greater fee. He came up the opening road in a hired sleigh between 2 storms in a fur collar worth more than a season of any hand's wages, and he filled the front room with the smell of cologne and certainty. And Adeline's hope rose in spite of itself, because here at last was a learned man, a man with shelves of books she had never been allowed to read. Surely he would see it. Surely the famous one would see what the country doctor had missed. He did not see it. He took Gideon's pulse against a gold watch. He looked at the tongue. He thumbed back an eyelid. He pressed the wasted belly with 2 soft white fingers and hummed to himself low and wise. He never once looked at the nails. He never once bent to smell the breath. He stood over a man being murdered by the spoonful, and he reached with perfect confidence for exactly the wrong word. Neurasthenia, Dr. Hartwell pronounced to the room, to the brothers, to the hands gathered anxious in the hall. A nervous exhaustion of the system. The frontier did it. The cold, the labor, the strain on a constitution not bred for such a country. He had seen it in army officers and in men of business. The vital organs, he said, simply lose heart. And the cure, Adeline made herself as small and meek from her corner, the picture of a frightened wife. Building the system back up, the great man said, red meat and beef tea, tonic freely, laudanum for the pain, and a strengthening cordial of his own, mixing dark and sweet, which he pressed into Mrs. Hollis's hands with grave instruction to give it twice a day without fail. More tonic, more of the very current the poison was riding in on. Adeline stood in her corner and felt the cold go all the way down, because she understood in that moment a thing she would carry to the end of her days, that a man can have every letter after his name and every book on his shelf and still be blind if he has decided what he is looking at before ever he looks. Dr. Hartwell had ridden 1,000 miles to find a fashionable sickness, so a fashionable sickness was what he found. The great man from the East had attended governors. He had letters after his name and a watch made of gold. And the apothecary's girl from Harkness, Ohio, with her last dollars spent and her dead father's herbs in a trunk, was the only soul in that whole snowbound house who was right. He stayed the one night. He took his fee, which was enormous, and Adeline watched Silas count it out slow bill by bill from the ranch's thin winter cash with a face full of brotherly sorrow. And she filed that too, because every dollar that left that house left it through Silas's soft and tender hands. In the morning, the great man climbed back into his furs, well pleased, and rode away down the mountain ahead of the next storm, and he left behind him one dark, sweet bottle of strengthening cordial. Adeline carried it out to the snowbank the moment his sleigh was small in the distance, and poured it into the white, and pressed the snow back over it with her boot. She had let herself believe for the length of one foolish afternoon that the famous man would save her the asking, that she could set the weight down into stronger, steadier hands. Instead, he had handed it straight back to her, heavier than before. There was no one coming. She knew it now, the way you know a door has locked behind you in the dark. Not the country doctor, not the great man from the east. No one in all that white world was going to look at Gideon Hale and see what she saw. The truth was hers. It had been hers since the spoon went black. And if she set it down, it would shatter and he would die, and they would write the wrong word over him the way they had written it over his father. So she picked it back up. Alone, the way she had carried everything, she found Granny Finch through Pearl, which was the only way anything good came to her that winter, through the child. There was an old woman who lived alone up a draw, 2 miles off a healer of the old kind herbs and poultices and the wisdom of 80 hard winters, and the hand spoke of her the way men speak of weather, and witches, both half scorn and half fear. Ada Finch. Granny Finch. She had birthed half the valley and laid out the other half, and she trusted no one and owed nothing. And when the snow let up for 2 days in the dead heart of winter, Adeline put on every warm thing she had and walked the 2 miles up the draw because she had run out of book and needed an elder. She did not tell the family where she went. She told Mrs. Hollis she was walking for air. Mrs. Hollis looked at her like she was simple. Let her think it. Granny Finch's cabin was small and warm and smelled of 100 drying plants, and the old woman looked at Adeline in the doorway with eyes like black beads and said, before Adeline had spoken one word, "You're the bride, the one married the dying Hale." She paused. "You don't have the face of a woman waiting on a fortune. You have the face of a woman scared out of her wits. Sit. Talk." And Adeline, who had carried it alone for weeks, who had stood in a sick room and let 2 doctors be wrong, and watched 3 men, and trusted none, sat down at that old woman's fire, and let it out, all of it. The spoon, and the copper, and the nails, and the garlic, and the dog that wouldn't drink, and the paper of death buried in her own trunk. And Granny Finch listened without a word, her old hands never stopping their work over a bowl of something. And when Adeline finished, the old woman was quiet a long moment. Then she said arsenic. Yes, Adeline breathed, the first soul in the world to say the word back to her. Yes, inheritance powder, Granny Finch said, her mouth twisted. That's the old name for it. You know why they call it that. She didn't wait for an answer, because it's the powder that moves the inheritance along. Slow. Looks like the wasting. Looks like God's own hand. I've seen it twice in 60 years, and both times it was kin. It's always kin, girl. A stranger shoots you. Kin poisons you, because kin can wait. It's always kin. Adeline thought of 3 brothers around a table. Can he be saved? She asked. And here Granny Finch set down her bowl and fixed Adeline with those black bead eyes and gave her the thing she had walked 2 miles through the snow to get, which was not a cure because there was no cure. There was no draft, no magic. This was 1884 in the high cold edge of the world, and there was no antidote on any shelf in any cabin in that whole white country. There's no medicine for it, Granny Finch said. None. Don't let that fool doctor or that fancy one they sent for fill him with tonics and tinctures. Every drop of medicine you put in him now is one more thing that ain't clean. You hear me? The cure is the absence of the poison. That's all. That's the whole of it. Tell me, Adeline said. You cut it off, the old woman said, every grain. He eats nothing, drinks nothing, takes nothing that don't come from your own 2 hands and your own clean water. Nothing, not a sip of broth from another soul. You boil his water from snow, you melt yourself. You feed him milk if you can get it clean. Milk binds it some, and burnt bread, charred, black, scraped it draws the poison the way charcoal draws a fever. My granny knew it, and hers before her. And you sweat him. You heat stones, and you pack him in quilts, and you sweat the devil out through his skin, because the body wants to throw it off the bodies. Smarter than the doctors. You just have to help it, and then get out of its way. And then, Adeline said. And then you wait, Granny Finch said. That's the hard part. That's the part that kills the women who try it. You wait. Weeks. While he looks like he's dying. While he looks worse before he looks better. Because that's how it goes. The poison's got a foothold, and it don't leave polite. You wait, and you keep him clean, and you don't let one other hand near him, and slow, if his heart holds and the damage ain't too deep, he climbs back up out of the grave 1 inch at a time. Weeks, Adeline said. The old woman's eyes sharpened. And here's what you ain't thought of yet, girl, because you're new at this, and your heart's in the right place, but your head's still soft. She leaned in. Well, he's getting better, the one who's doing it. They'll see. They'll see the color come back. They'll see him eat. And they'll know their slow, safe, quiet poison stopped working. And a patient poisoner who sees his work undone don't go away. He gets bold. He gets frightened. And a frightened man with arsenic don't wait around for weeks no more. He finishes it fast with whatever's to hand. The fire popped. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, patient, sealing the world. So you've got a choice, Granny Finch said, and her old voice was gentle, now gentle and terrible. You can save him slow out in the open, and the moment he starts to mend, you tell that snake you found him out, and he kills your husband in a week, and likely you with him, and there's no law closer than the spring. Or, Adeline said. The old woman smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who had outlived everyone who ever crossed her. Or you save him quiet, she said, and you let the whole house go on believing he's dying. You let the snake watch his poison work slow and sure, right on schedule, never knowing the man's getting strong as an ox underneath the play acting. You keep that secret like your life depends on it, because it does, and his does. And you wait. You wait until that snake is so sure of his work, so easy, so bold, that he comes to do the last little bit himself, where you can see him, where there's eyes to see him. And then he hangs himself, Adeline whispered. Then he hangs himself, said Granny Finch. And not you, and not your husband. And you don't lift a hand, girl. You hear me? Not one hand. You let his own wickedness be the rope, and let the law be the drop, because the day you pick up the poison yourself is the day you become the thing you're fighting, and I won't teach you to be that. My granny didn't teach me to be that. You save the man, and you keep your soul. Both. That's the only victory worth the damn. Adeline walked the 2 miles home through the falling snow with the whole shape of it clear in her mind. At last cold and complete a plan that turned her stomach and steadied her spine in the same breath. Save him in secret. Let them think him dying. Bait the trap with his own apparent death. And wait for the killer to grow bold enough to finish it, where there were witnesses and the spring and the law. It meant lying to the whole house. Lying to kind Silas. Lying to the watching Eli. Lying to Doc Pruitt and Mrs. Hollis, and even God forgive her, performing a little for Pearl, who must not be able to act a lie, and so must half believe it too. It meant nursing Gideon back from the dead with one hand, while pretending with the other that she was only easing him toward the grave. It meant becoming for a season a kind of liar she had never been. She thought she could not do it. Then she came over the last rise and saw the house in the dusk, gold lamplight, in the windows, smoke straight up, beautiful exactly as the letters had promised, like God had pulled a sheet over a tired world. and she thought of the dog that wouldn't drink, and the nails that kept a calendar, and a hard old man under the hill who never got his soft word, and a big still man who'd turned to stone so he couldn't be hurt, and got hurt anyway, dying, trying to find the words. And she found she could do it after all. She told Gideon that night. She sat by his bed, and she told him all of it low and fast, the copper and the test, and the paper in her trunk, and the 2 miles, and the old woman, and the only way out. And he listened with those fever-bright eyes fixed on her face. And when she got to the part about the play, acting about how the whole house must believe he was dying right up to the end, about how he would have to lie in this bed and pretend to fade while he was secretly growing strong, his jaw set hard. "You're asking me to play dead," he said, "in my own house, while I find out which of my brothers wants me in the ground." "Yes," she said, "and let them think it's working." "Yes, and not lift a hand, while I get strong enough to break him in half." "Yes," Adeline said, "that's exactly what I'm asking. Because if you reach for him the day you're strong, you'll be a poisoned man's word against a healthy man's lie, with no law for 100 miles, and no proof but a black spoon. But if you wait, if you let him come to you, if you let the whole house watch him do it," she leaned in, "then he can't lie his way out. Then it's not your word, it's his own hand, in front of God and everyone." A long silence. Then Gideon Hale, dying, poisoned, betrayed, did a thing she had not seen him do once in all the long winter. He laughed, low and rough and real, just once. "My father," he said, "spent 30 years wishing I was hard enough. And it turns out I married the hardest thing in this whole country, and she's about 5'3". It was the first joke he had ever made to her. It was the first time she had ever heard the man of the letters fully, with no fever in it, no ink between them, just him, warm and quick and clever, alive in the eyes. And Adeline, who had been so afraid for so long, who had carried it all alone, felt something break open in her chest that had nothing to do with the plan and everything to do with the man, and she had to look down at her hands to keep her own face in order. "We have a deal, Mr. Hale," she said. "We have a deal, Mrs. Hale," he said, and from somewhere far down in the long lie they were about to tell, together a real thing had been born between them, the way the only real things ever come. In the dark and the danger, with the whole world snowed shut against them, they began the next morning. It was a strange and double life, that next stretch of winter, and Adeline lived every hour of it on a wire. By day, she played the grieving young wife. She let her face go pale and her eyes go red. She let Mrs. Hollis catch her weeping in the hall, where weeping would be reported. She spoke of Gideon in the low, careful past tense of a woman bracing for a coffin. She asked Silas in a small, broken voice how one arranged a burial when the ground was frozen, and watched Silas's kind face fill with tender sorrow as he explained gently that they kept the dead in the cold smokehouse until the spring thaw made a grave possible. The way they'd kept their father. The way they'd kept their father. She filed that. She filed everything now. And, by night, behind the locked door with the lamp turned low and a chair wedged under the latch, she fought for Gideon Hale's life with everything that old woman had taught her. She melted snow for his water and boiled it twice. She charred bread black on the kitchen coals in the dead of night, and scraped the char, and stirred it into clean milk, and got it into him, and he drank it down, though it was vile. Drank it because she held it only ever, because she held it. She heated stones in the hearth, and packed him in quilts until the sweat ran off him in sheets, and the room reeked of sickness, leaving a body. And she changed the soaked linens herself, and burned the worst of them, so no other hand would touch them. She fed him by the spoonful, her food, her clean covered pot, and she never, not once in all those weeks, let a single thing pass his lips that had been within reach of another living hand. And it was as the old woman had promised. He got worse before he got better. There was a night in the first week she thought she had killed him with her own stubbornness, when his heart went fast and thin and skipping under her ear, and his lips went blue at the edges, and she lay against his chest in the dark, counting that ragged heartbeat. and bargaining with a God she wasn't sure she believed in. And somewhere toward dawn, the heart steadied, slowed, found its road again, and she wept, then silent, into the quilt from sheer animal relief. And then, slow, so slow she dared not believe it, he began to climb. The gray left his skin a shade at a time. The fever broke and stayed broke. One morning he ate a whole bowl of her broth and asked Lo for more, and she had to leave the room so the hands wouldn't hear her laughing and crying at once in the hall. The tremor in his hands quieted. The flesh, God be praised, the flesh began here and there to come back to the big frame, and she had to bind his shirt looser and stoop his shoulders and coach him fiercely in whispers to keep playing the dying man, to keep his face gray and his voice weak whenever another soul was in the room, because the danger now was not the poison. The danger now was that he looked too alive. "Keep your eyes down," she whispered. "The morning Mrs. Hollis came to change the water. Slow your breath. You're fading, you hear me. You're almost gone." And the great strong man, mending vital, full of a banked and burning rage at whichever brother had done this, lay back against the pillows and let his eyes go dull and his breath go shallow, and played a dying man for the woman who had saved him and trusted her so completely, now that he would have played a corpse if she'd asked it. It should have been their worst time. It was, in a way, she could never have predicted the sweetest. Because in the long nights of the secret cure, with the door locked and the world shut out, they had nothing to do but heal him and talk. And they talked the way you only can in a sealed room in a long winter, with death at the door, with nothing held back, because what was the use of holding back now? He told her about the dog from the third letter, the one he'd had as a boy. And she went still, because it was in the letter. It was word for word the letter. And she looked at him, and the question she had carried all winter finally came out of her. The letters, she said. Was it you? Who wrote them? And Gideon Hale, mending in the lamplight, went very quiet. And something crossed his face, guilt and grief, and something she could not read at all. "Adeline," he said, and stopped. "Adeline, there's a thing I have to tell you about the letters. And I've been a coward not to all winter, because I was afraid of how you'd look at me when you knew." Her heart climbed into her throat. "Tell me," she said. And outside the locked door, a floorboard creaked. They both froze. A footstep. In the hall. Soft. Stopping. Right outside the door, where for weeks a chair had been wedged under the latch, and a low voice had carried the secret that had to stay sealed, the secret that was keeping a man alive. How long had it been there? How much had it heard? A man getting strong, a man and a woman talking low and warm, where a dying man should be alone and silent. Adeline rose without a sound, her heart slamming, and crossed to the door and listened, her hand over her own mouth. Another creak, moving off now, slow, down the hall, toward the stairs. She eased the chair aside an inch, eased the door, put her eye to the crack, and in the dim hall, walking away, his soft indoor hand trailing along the wall, his fair head bent in thought, was the brother who ran the books, the brother who fetched the doctor, the brother who pressed the cup, the kind one, the only one who had ever made her laugh. Silas paused at the top of the stairs and turned and looked back down the hall at the closed door of the dying man's room. A long, still, thoughtful look, a look with no kindness in it at all, a look she had never once seen on that warm, easy face in all the winter. Then he smiled to himself, small and private, and went down the stairs. And Adeline Hale stood frozen, with her eye to the crack, and the cold truth pouring into her like meltwater, because she knew that look. She had been trying all winter not to know it. The killer had heard something, maybe everything, maybe only enough. And the kindest man in the house had just smiled at a dying man's door, like a man who had decided it was time to stop waiting. She did not sleep that night either. But it was a different kind of waking now, because the thing she had dreaded all winter had a name and a face at last. And the name was the one she had prayed it would not be. and the face was the only one that had ever been kind to her. Silas. She turned it over and over in the dark, testing it, the way her father taught her, checking every figure twice, because she would not hang a man on a creek in a hall and a private smile. But the figures all came home now. They had been coming home for weeks, and she had been pushing them apart with both hands because the sum was so ugly. Silas ran the books. Silas had set the folder in front of Vane's lawyer to sell the South Timber and lied and called it a feed contract. Silas fetched the tonic. Silas pressed the cup. Silas slept the deep, easy sleep of a man with nothing on his conscience, and she had filed that wrong all winter. She had filed that wrong because she had thought it meant innocence. It did not mean innocence. It meant he felt nothing at all. A man can only sleep that sound, she thought, if there's nothing down there to keep him up. No conscience to creak. Nothing. And the kindness, the warmth, the jokes that made her laugh in a house of grief. She saw it now in the cold light of 3 a.m, and it turned her stomach because it had not been kindness. It had been management. He had been the one soft hand in a hard house, because the soft hand draws no suspicion. Who looks at the brother who weeps? Who fetches the doctor? Who frets over the dosing with tears in his eyes? Nobody. You look at the silent one with the scar. You look at the frightening one who walks the halls at night. You look at Eli. She had looked at Eli all winter. They were meant to. The whole design depended on it. The kind brother does the killing, and the frightening brother takes the eye, and if it ever came to a hanging well, there was a man with a scar and a war behind him, and a quarrel with the dead ready-made, and a stranger bride with a paper of poison in her trunk, for when one scapegoat was not enough. She had nearly given them Eli. In her own heart, she had nearly handed him over. The shame of that sat in her like a stone. Gideon woke before light the way he always had, the habit too deep for poison to kill, and he found her sitting up in the hard chair, with her hands knotted in her lap, and her face gray in the last of the lamplight. "You know," he said. "Not a question." "I know," she said. "Say it." "Silas," she said. And she watched it land on him. She had braced for rage, for the great body to come up out of the bed roaring. It did not. That was the worst of it somehow. Gideon Hale lay very still and looked at the ceiling, and something in his face simply folded inward quiet. Final, a door closing on a room he could never enter again. And when he spoke, his voice was low and even, and the most terrible thing she had ever heard. "He held the lamp for me," Gideon said, "when we buried our father. It was so cold the lantern oil near froze. And Silas held the lamp so I could see to set the stones. He cried. I remember he cried. He cried because it worked." Adeline said, gentle as she could, "Your father was the first, wasn't he? The wasting that runs in the blood. There's no wasting, Gideon. There never was. There was only Silas. And a powder. And a patience that goes back more than a year." Gideon closed his eyes. "He killed our father," he said to the dark behind his own lids. And he held the lamp. And he cried. And then he was quiet a long while. And when he opened his eyes again, they had changed. The grief burned down into something harder and clearer, and Adeline understood that whatever soft thing had lived in this man for his lost brother had just died in this bed beside him, and what was left was only the will to finish it. "How long," he said, "until I'm strong enough?" "You're strong enough now to fool him," she said. "You're not strong enough to fight him." "Not yet, and it can't come to a fight. We talked about this. It can't be your fist. It has to be his hand and the law's rope. We hold the course. We let him think it's working. We wait for him to come and finish it where there's eyes." "Eyes," Gideon said. "There's no law for 100 miles. The pass is shut." "The pass won't be shut forever," she said, and she looked toward the window where the black was just beginning to go gray, where far down the buried valley the first slow promise of a thaw was still weeks away, but coming, always coming, the way spring always comes even to that high, cold edge of the world. When the road opens, the law comes up it. We hold him until then. We give him no reason to rush. We give him a dying man and a grieving wife and all the time in the world. And if he rushes anyway, Gideon said. She did not have an answer for that, so she gave him the truth. Then we're in God's hands, she said, and we move faster than he does. Two things happened in the next days that nearly broke the plan in half. The first was Eli. He cornered her in the cold pantry. She had gone in for the milk alone in the gray of an afternoon, and she turned and he was simply there, filling the doorway. The way his brothers filled doorways, the scar livid in the dim light, and her heart leapt into her throat, because for one wild instant, the old fear came roaring back. The monster wears a monster's face, and she had a knife on the shelf behind her, and her hand went toward it. Eli saw her hand move, and stopped where he was, and held both his own hands out from his sides, open slow, the way you gentle a spooked horse. I'm not the one, he said. Low, rough. You know I'm not. You've known a while. She did not move. She did not take her hand from the shelf. Prove it, she said. A flicker of something crossed the hard face. It might have been respect. I can't, he said. That's the hell of it. A man can't prove he didn't. But I'll tell you what I know, and you do what you want with it. He drew a breath. I've watched this house for a year. Since Pa went thin, I knew it wasn't right. Old man drank from a spring his whole life, hard as a boot, and then he's gray and wasted in 4 months. I knew. I just couldn't see the hand. Go on, Adeline said. I've been watching the medicines, Eli said, watching who goes near the pantry at night, watching the books when Silas leaves them out. He paused. There's money gone, ma'am. A lot of it. The timber money, the cattle money. Years of it. Silas keeps the books, and the books are a lie. I can read enough to know that much. There's a hole in this ranch you could drive a wagon through, and it all runs out through Cyrus Vane's bank. My brother owes that fat snake more than this whole place is worth. The room went very still around Adeline, so he sold the timber, she said. Quiet. Behind Gideon's back. Tried to. Eli said Gideon caught the paper, stopped the sale last fall, and that's when Pa's wasting sickness. He said the word with a curl of contempt. That's when it jumped to Gideon. You see it. The day Gideon blocked the money was the day Gideon started to die. She saw it. God help her, she saw all of it now, the whole black machine of it laid out clean. Why didn't you say anything, she said. To Gideon. To anyone. Eli's jaw worked. Say what he said. And to who? I'm the one nobody trusts. I came back from the war wrong, and I never came right. And this whole valley looks at me sideways and waits for me to do something terrible. I say my brother's a thief and a poisoner with no proof, but a feeling and a crooked ledger, and you know what they hear. Oh my ear. They hear the crazy scarred one finally cracked. They hear me building a story to take the ranch for myself. He looked at her, and there was a whole lifetime of loneliness in it. You're the first soul in this house ever looked at me and didn't flinch first and think second. The child. And now you. And Adeline took her hand off the knife because she believed him, not from proof. From the thing under proof, the thing her father could never put in a book, the thing you know, the way you know a tincture has turned. The frightening brother was not the danger. The frightening brother had been standing guard over this poisoned house for a year alone. Mistrusted the only one who saw, the only one who could do nothing. A killer does not soothe the children, she thought. She had been right the first time. Then help me, she said. And she told him. Some of it. Enough. That Gideon was mending in secret. That the whole performance of the dying man was a trap. That they were waiting for Silas to grow bold enough to finish it in front of witnesses and for the thaw to bring the law. And Eli listened, and his hard face went through something hope and grief and a terrible relief all at once. And when she finished, he said only low, "What do you need?" "I need you to be my eyes when I sleep," she said. "I need you to watch him. And I need you when the time comes to ride for the marshal. The hour the pass opens before Silas knows it's open. Can you do that? I've been waiting a year to do something Eli said. Yes, so she had an ally. The frightening one. The mistrusted one. The one her own fear had nearly martyred. And that was the first thing. The second thing nearly killed them all, because Cyrus Vane did not wait for spring. He came up the road on the last hard crust of the winter snow in his fine sleigh, with 6 men this time, not 2. 6 men with rifles across their saddles, and he did not come to make a neighborly offer. He came to collect. Adeline watched them come from the upstairs window with her heart in her mouth, and she understood at once what it meant. Silas had heard something at that door. Maybe he had heard the man getting strong. Maybe he had only heard a wife who did not sound like a widow. Either way, the kind brother had gotten frightened, and a frightened man with a hole in the books had gone running to the man who owned his debts. And now Cyrus Vane had come to take the ranch, while its master lay dying before the master could do the inconvenient thing and recover. They came into the yard, and the hands came out uneasy, and Vane stood up in his sleigh in his fine wool with his soft smile and called out, pleasant as Sunday, that he had come to see his old friend Gideon and to discuss the transfer of the property, given the sad circumstances, given that the poor man was not long for this world, given that arrangements had been made. Arrangements, Adeline thought. He means the deed. He means Silas has signed it over already against the debt, and Vane's come to make it real over a dying man's body. And then Cyrus Vane said the thing that turned her blood to ice. He looked up at the house, at the very window where she stood, and he smiled wider, and he said to the yard at large that, of course, everyone understood the delicacy. A man dies. A young widow inherits a stranger, an Eastern girl who married a sick man in a great hurry. People talk. People wonder. It would be a terrible thing, Vane said, if questions were ever raised about how exactly poor Gideon Hale came to waste away so sudden with a new wife at his bedside mixing his medicine. A terrible thing for that girl, unless she were sensible, unless she signed where she was told and went back east with a little money and her good name and no questions asked. There it was. The whole trap said out loud at last in front of the yard and the hands and God himself. Every word of it, the thing she had already known alone since the night her fingers found that twist of paper buried in her own trunk. Not just to kill Gideon, to pin it on her. The stranger, the newcomer, the one the whole table had watched stir his cup. The scapegoat chosen from the very first letter, drawn 1,000 miles by a borrowed soul. Kept friendless on purpose so there would be no one left to swear for her. She did not feel the floor tilt this time. She had felt that already months ago in the dark on her knees with the poison cold in her hand. Now she only felt the old winter settle back into her bones and her hand close hard on the sill. And down in the yard the standoff drew tight as a wire. Vane's 6 men with their rifles. The Hale hands fewer and armed only with whatever was to hand, and uncertain because their master was dying, and the books were a mystery, and a man with a bank and a smile was telling them how the world was going to be. It hung there, one wrong word from breaking into blood. And then the door of the house opened, and Gideon Hale walked out onto the porch. He should not have been able to. He was weeks from whole. But Adeline had built him back, inch by inch, with charred bread and clean water, and the sweat of the stones, and his heart had held, and his will was a thing the poison had never touched, and he came out into the gray daylight on his own, 2 feet, gaunt, still hollow, still but upright, a big dark gaunt man with a borrowed strength and a banked fire in his eyes. And he had his father's old rifle in his hands. The yard went dead silent, because Cyrus Vane had come to take a dead man's land, and the dead man was standing on his own porch. "You're looking peaked," Cyrus, Gideon said. His voice was thin, but it carried. "Long ride for nothing." And Vane's smile slipped, just for an instant, But Adeline saw it slip, and she saw the fast, ugly recalculation behind the pale eyes, because a poisoner's whole plan depends on the poison working. And here was the proof in the doorway that it had stopped working, that something had gone wrong, that the dying man was not dying. And Cyrus Vane did not yet know how, but he knew the way a gambler knows that the table had turned under him. 6 guns, Vane said, recovering the oil coming back into his voice. Against how many, Gideon? And you can barely stand. He can barely stand, Adeline thought from the window, her nails in her palms. But he's standing. And then came the sound. Faint at first, under the wind. So faint she thought she imagined it. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming up the buried road from the valley. Vane heard it too. His head came around. Because the thaw had begun 3 days early down in the low country, the way it does some years, a warm wind off the south slopes opening the lower road, while the high pass still held, and Eli, watching faithful, had not waited for Adeline to give the word. The hour the low road softened, Eli had slipped out before dawn and ridden hard for the nearest ranches. The Hale neighbors, the men who had known Jedediah Hale 40 years, and owed him and respected him, and did not love Cyrus Vane. And he had told them plain that Vane was riding on the Hale place with armed men to take it off a sick man, and would they come? And they came. They came up over the rise in the gray morning, a dozen of them. 15 ranchers and their grown sons, and their hands on their winter horses with their own rifles across their own saddles, and they fanned out along the ridge above the yard, and they sat there silent, a wall of hard-mounted men, looking down, and at the head of them rode Eli Hale, with the scar livid on his face, and no fear in him at all. And just like that, the arithmetic of the yard changed. 6 guns from the valley against 15 from the mountain, and a gaunt man on his porch, and the whole weight of a country that had buried Jedediah Hale and would not stand to see his son robbed, dying. Cyrus Vane sat in his fine sleigh and looked at the ridge, and looked at the porch, and did the only sum a coward ever does well, the sum of his own skin. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is," Gideon said. And Cyrus Vane turned his sleigh in the trampled snow and went back down the mountain the way he had come, his 6 men behind him, and the Hale neighbors sat their horses on the ridge and watched him all the way down until the valley swallowed him, and only then did they come down into the yard, and there was no cheering. It was not that kind of country. There was only a hard, quiet, nodding men closing around a man in trouble, and Gideon Hale stood on his porch among them and did not fall until the door was shut behind him, and only Adeline could see. She caught him, as much as a woman of 5'3" can catch a falling mountain. She got him to the chair by the fire, and his heart was going hard, and his face was gray with the cost of it, and he gripped her hand and would not let go. "You shouldn't have," she said, fierce, furious with fear for him. "You could have died on that porch. You weren't ready." "I wasn't going to let him stand in my yard and call you a murderer," Gideon said. And that stopped her, cold, because no one had ever in all her life stood up out of a near grave to defend her name. The road was open, the low road at least, which meant the thing they had waited all winter for was finally suddenly here. The law could come up that road now, and so could the end. It moved fast after that, the way these things do after a long, slow winter of holding still. All the patience spends itself at once. Eli rode again the next morning for the valley town, for the one man in that country whose authority Cyrus Vane could not buy, because he answered to Washington and not to the bank. A United States Marshal, Samuel Dawes, a spare, gray, unhurried man with a star worn dull, and eyes that had seen every lie a frightened man could tell, and Eli laid it before him, plain the dead father, the dying brother, the crooked books, the powder, the bride brought west to take the blame, and Marshal Dawes listened to all of it without a word. and then said only that he would ride up and see for himself, because a scarred man's story was not proof, but a scarred man's story plus a black spoon plus a ledger full of holes might be the beginning of it. And while Eli rode, Adeline set the trap. Because they could not simply accuse Silas. They had been over this 100 times in the locked dark. A black spoon and a paper of poison and a crooked ledger and the word of a stranger and a scarred man. Silas would weep. Silas would be baffled and wounded and so very reasonable. And he would turn it around the way he turned everything. And before the marshal's horse was cool, he would have them all believing it was the Eastern girl, after all. The one who mixed the medicine, the one who stood to inherit the one with the very poison sewn into her own coat. And hadn't poor frightened Eli always been unwell? No, it could not be an accusation. It had to be a hand in the act. It had to be Silas with the powder at the cup, where the marshal could see him do it. So they gave him the perfect chance. They gave him a closing window, because nothing makes a patient man rush like the fear that his patience is about to be ruined. Adeline let it be known through Mrs. Hollis, who carried news through that house like water downhill, that Gideon had taken a sudden turn for the worse, that the recovery she'd hoped for had been false dawn, that Doc Pruitt sent for one last time had come and gone with a grave face and said it was a matter now of a day or two, no more. She let it be known that the marshal was coming up from the valley drawn by talk to look into the deaths in the Hale family and would arrive by week's end. She watched Silas take in that last piece. The marshal coming by week's end. And she watched the calculation move behind the warm, easy eyes. The same flicker she'd seen on Cyrus Vane because she had handed Silas an unbearable arithmetic, and she had done it on purpose. Gideon mending was a disaster. The slow poison had failed. Somehow it had failed. And now the law was coming, which meant the dying had to be finished before the law arrived. It had to look natural, a last sad gasp of the family wasting a man simply slipping away in the night, a day before the marshal came too late, so sad nothing to be done. It had to be tonight or tomorrow. It had to be fast. And it had to be the powder one last big dose into the dying man's cup to carry him off before he could recover enough to talk or the law arrive to listen. She had built him a corner, and a patient poisoner in a corner stops being patient. The trap was set for the third night. They were ready. Gideon lay in the bed playing the last hours of a dying man, gray-faced still, his breath shallow. The great body slack against the pillows and under the quilt. His hand rested near his father's rifle, and his eyes, when no one watched, were clear and hard and awake. Eli was back and had brought the marshal in quiet, after dark, up the back stairs, and Samuel Dawes now stood in the deep shadow of the wardrobe in the corner of the sick room, motionless, his star in his pocket, and his patience the equal of any poisoner's. Doc Pruitt was there too, fetched, and told the truth at last, and gray with the horror of it, standing witness in the dark by the window. And Mrs. Hollis, who had wept when they told her who had loved Silas like her own, stood in the shadow by the door, because they needed the soul who had trusted him most to see it with her own eyes. And Adeline played her own part. She sat by the bed in the lamplight, the picture of the exhausted dying man's wife, and she let her shoulders sag and her head bow, and at the appointed hour she rose and stretched, and said aloud to the room, to the listening house, that she was worn to the bone, that she would lie down an hour in the next room, that surely he would last the night, and would somebody sit with him while she rested. And she went out, and left the cup on the side table, the cloudy tonic, full, within reach of the bed where a man lay dying. And the room held its breath in the dark. It did not take long. The latch lifted soft, the door eased open, and Silas Hale came into the lamp-lit room where his brother lay dying, and he was so gentle about it, so tender, easing the door shut behind him, crossing to the bed on quiet feet, and he stood over Gideon a moment and looked down at him with an expression Adeline would describe to herself for the rest of her life and never quite find the words for, because it was not hatred. Hatred she could have understood. It was nothing. It was a man looking at a sum nearly finished, a column nearly added, a chore nearly done. And then Silas turned to the door and put his head out, and Adeline, watching through the crack of the next room with the marshal's promise that no one would move until the powder touched the cup, heard him say soft and kind to the hand dozing in the hall that he'd sit with his brother a while, that the poor man needed quiet. Now that everyone should go on down and get some rest, he'd watch over Gideon himself, send the others away, clear the room, so there'd be no eyes. It was the oldest move there was, and he made it so gently, so lovingly, the brother taking the night watch so the others could sleep, and the hand thanked him and went gratefully off down the stairs, and Silas shut the door, and now he thought he was alone with a dying man, and no witness in the world. He was not alone. He took the little paper from his vest pocket. Adeline saw it in the lamplight, the small folded paper, the same square of paper her father had folded 1,000 times behind the counter. He unfolded it with his soft, careful hands, and he crossed to the side table, and he picked up the cup of cloudy tonic, the dying man's cup, and he tipped the white powder into it. A heavy dose, a final dose, far more than the slow, patient grains of all the long winter, enough to finish a weak man by dawn, and call it the wasting. And he took up the spoon to stir it in. 3 turns, Adeline thought, wild, hysterical, from behind the door. He'll stir it 3 turns, they always. And the marshal stepped out of the shadow of the wardrobe. Hold it right there, Samuel Dawes said. What happened in the next breath, Adeline would never fully untangle. Silas spun the cup in one hand, the spoon in the other, his face for one naked instant, utterly undone, the warmth and the kindness sloughing off it like a snake's old skin, and underneath was something she had never seen and never wanted to see again, cornered and white and ancient. And Gideon Hale rose up out of the bed. Not a dying man, a living one. Gaunt, yes, hollowed by a winter of poison, but upright and whole and terrible, his eyes blazing. His father's son risen from the grave. His own brother had been digging by the spoonful for months, and Silas Hale looked at his brother, standing alive and strong where a corpse should be, and the cup fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the poison tonic spreading dark across the boards, and Silas made a sound that was not a word. There were witnesses in the corners of that room. The marshal, with the powder paper already in his gloved hand, lifted from where it fell. The doctor, gray and shaking, who had seen with his own eyes the brother pour the dose. And Mrs. Hollis, who had loved him with her hand over her mouth, and tears pouring down her old face because the worst thing in the world had just happened in front of her, and there was no unseeing it. And Adeline came into the room, and stood beside her husband, and did not lift a hand. She had promised the old woman that, and she kept it. She did not touch Silas. She did not strike him. She did not pour the powder down his throat, though some dark part of her, the part that had counted his brother's heartbeat, skipping toward death in the dark, wanted to. She only reached into the lining of her coat and drew out the square of clean cloth she had carried for weeks and unfolded it, and laid its 2 contents on the side table in the lamplight where every soul in that room could see, the blackened spoon and the twist of arsenic that had been planted in her own trunk to hang her. She set them down beside the marshal's hand, the proof she had kept all winter, and she said the thing she had carried just as long, quiet, into the ringing silence. You wrote the letter, she said. It was not a question. She knew. She had known since the floorboard creaked, since she'd matched the warm, clever pen to the only warm, clever tongue in that house. And Gideon, weeks ago, with a footstep in the hall, had been trying to confess the thing he was ashamed of, that he had let his silver-tongued brother court her on paper, because he could not find the words himself, never dreaming, never once dreaming what his brother was courting her for. Silas looked at her, and, the strangest thing, even now, Even caught, even finished the charm, came up in him one last time. Automatic, a reflex, the warm, rueful smile, the smile that had made her laugh in a house of grief. "I wrote them," he said, and his voice was soft and almost fond. "I'll tell you a thing, Eastern girl, they were the truest thing I ever did. I meant every word. I put the notice in the papers myself in his name and read every sorry reply that came back." He shrugged a small, terrible shrug. "I needed a hand to hold the cup, and you had the prettiest hand of the lot. I thought there's a girl with no people and no place and a child to feed. There's a girl who'll be grateful and blamed and gone." And Adeline understood fully at last the whole black architecture of it. The debt to Vane, the stolen years of timber money, the father poisoned to bring the inheritance forward, and the inheritance gone to debt before it came. Gideon poisoned next the day he blocked the sale and became the only thing standing between Silas and Vane's ledger. And a bride. A friendless, grateful bride drawn across a continent by a beautiful borrowed soul to stand at the bedside and mix the medicine and hang for it while the kind brother wept at 2 more Hale funerals and signed the ruined ranch over to the bank and walked away clean. It was the cruelest thing she had ever heard, and it had so nearly worked. Marshal Dawes took Silas Hale by the arm. There was no struggle. The fight went out of him all at once, the way it goes out of a sum when the last figure's added and it doesn't come out the way you swore it would. Dawes had the paper of arsenic poured by Silas's own hand into the cup of a man everyone could now plainly see was alive, witnessed by a doctor and a marshal both. He had the second paper, too, the one drawn from the lining of the bride's coat, the planted dose that had waited all winter to hang her. He had the crooked ledgers Eli had gathered the whole in the books that ran straight to Vane's bank. And by spring, when the high pass opened fully and the circuit court came up the valley, he would have the rest the apothecary down in the territory capital, who recalled a fair-haired, charming man buying rat powder by the ounce, more rat powder than any ranch on earth had rats, and the forged deed in Vane's safe with a dead man's name traced in Silas's own clean hand. Cyrus Vane would stand trial too, for the fraud and the conspiracy and the armed ride on the Hale place. His bank would not save him. His newspaper would not save him. The country that had watched him climb would watch him fall and not be sorry. But that was spring's business. That night, there was only a marshal leading a poisoner out into the cold, and a house that would never be the same, and the slow, stunned grief of people who had loved a man who turned out to be a hollow place wearing a kind face. Mrs. Hollis wept in the kitchen for a long time, and Adeline sat with her and did not say, "It's all right," because it was not all right. But she held the old woman's hands, and after a while Mrs. Hollis said, broken, that she was sorry that she'd watched the bride all winter and thought, "God forgive me." She thought the worst, and Adeline said she knew, and that there was nothing to forgive because it had been built that way on purpose, the suspicion by a clever, cruel hand, and any soul would have thought it. And Eli stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the scarred, frightening one, the faithful one who had ridden 2 hard rides and brought the law and the neighbors both. And Adeline crossed to him and took both his rough hands in hers in front of everyone and said thank you and held his gaze and did not flinch. And the hard face of the man nobody trusted came apart just for a moment, and he had to look away. The thaw came in earnest a few weeks later. It came the way spring always comes to that high country slow, and then all at once the snow going gray, and then going to water, the eaves running the buried road rising up out of the white, the black mountains shrugging off their winter one bare patch at a time, and the whole sealed world that had held them prisoner all those months simply opened like a hand unclenching. And the open road meant the thing it had always meant. Adeline could leave. That was the truth of it, and she made herself look straight at it, because she had promised herself in Ohio she would never again build a life on a thing she had not looked at square. She was free now, vindicated, her name cleaner testimony given the real poisoner in the marshal's jail awaiting the spring court. She had a little money owed to her and a clear road down the mountain and the whole rest of her life. And she owed this place nothing now. Less than nothing. This place had nearly killed her and her sister both. She could take Pearl and the carpet bags and go back east and start fresh somewhere no one knew, a woman with a story she'd never tell. And Gideon Hale, mending now in earnest the flesh back on the big frame, the color in his face, his strength returning by the day, knew it too. He found her on the porch in the first warm evening of the year, the light long and gold over the running snow, and he stood beside her at the rail, not too close the way he had always given her room, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then he said the hardest thing she had ever heard a man say, and the best. "The road's open," Gideon said. "You can go." "I know," she said. "I mean it," he said, and his voice was rough. "You came here on a lie, the cruelest lie there ever was. You came because the man who's going to hang wrote you beautiful letters in my name, and I let him, God help me. I let him because I was too much a coward to say to a stranger the things I felt. So, you never chose this. You never chose me. You chose a man who doesn't exist, and you got a sick stranger and a poisoned house and a winter that near killed you." He looked out at the mountains. "You don't owe me a winter more. There's money for you and the child. There's a wagon and a man to drive you down whenever you say. You can go home." And Adeline Hale stood at the rail in the gold light and let the whole offer settle into her, the freedom of it. The clean, honest freedom, a man handing her the open door with both hands, and no chain on it. "No, you're mine. No, you belong to me. No cage dressed up as devotion. Just, you can go." It was the most anyone had ever respected her in her life, and that was how she knew. "You're right," she said. "I never chose you." She watched it land on him, watched the big shoulders take it brace for it, the way he'd braced for everything that long winter. "I chose a man in a letter," she said, "and I was a fool because he wasn't real." She turned to face him. "But I spent a winter, Gideon, locked in a room with the real one. I counted his heartbeat in the dark when I thought it would stop. I fed him char and snow water with my own hands and watched him choose every single day to keep fighting and keep playing dead and keep his word to me, even dying. I heard the real man tell me about a dog he had when he was a boy. The letter told me too, but the letter never had to look me in the eye and be ashamed and tell me anyway." He was very still. "I didn't fall in love with the letter," she said. Her voice shook now, and she let it. "I fell in love with the man who was too honest to keep writing them. The man who stood up out of his deathbed to keep one fat coward from calling me a murderer in my own yard. I know exactly who you are, Gideon Hale. I learned it the hard way all winter with no ink to hide behind, and I'm not leaving him." And then she said the thing that mattered most. Because she had thought about it all those weeks, what kind of life was worth staying for, and she would not stay for the old kind, the kind where a woman is kept and protected and owned and called precious like a thing on a shelf. "But not as your rescue," she said, "and not as your widow that wasn't, and not as some poor grateful girl you took pity on." She lifted her chin. "This ranch nearly died because one man kept all the books and all the secrets and let no one see. I won't live in a house run that way. If I stay as your partner, mine on the deed beside yours. My hand on the ledgers Eli and I will keep honest between us. My say in this place equal to yours. I've got a head for figures and a healer's hands, and this country needs both, and I am done. I am so done being something a man keeps. I'll be something a man stands beside, or I'll take that wagon. Those are the terms." And Gideon Hale looked down at this woman of 5'3", who had walked into his barn and saved a hand's arm and walked into his marriage on a lie and walked through a whole winter of poison and suspicion and come out the other side harder and clearer and more wholly herself than anyone he had ever known. And the slow, rare smile came over his gaunt face. The real one, the one from the letters that had turned out to live in him after all. "Partners," he said. "Partners," she said. And he held out his big scarred hand the way he'd held it out to a frightened child in a doorway months ago, palm up, offering, never taking. And Adeline put her hand in it, and they shook on it once solemn as bankers equal as two souls can be. And then, only then, after the deal was struck, and the terms were clear, and she was no man's rescue and no man's property, but her own woman choosing with her eyes open, she stepped in close and he bent his dark head, and they kissed, for the first time really kissed, in the long gold light of the first spring evening, with the snow running to water all around them, and the whole hard winter behind them, and the door wide open at her back, unlocked, unguarded hers, to walk through any time she liked. She never did walk through it, but it mattered all the rest of her days that she always could have. The spring brought the law, and the law brought justice full and clean and public the way that country liked it. Cyrus Vane and Silas Hale were tried in the valley town before the circuit judge, and the whole county came down out of the hills to see it. The crooked ledgers were read out. The apothecary testified to the ounces of rat powder. Doc Pruitt told how he'd been fooled into prescribing the very poison. Marshal Dawes told what he'd seen with his own eyes in the lamplit room. And Adeline Hale took the stand calm and clear and told the court about a black spoon and a calendar written in a man's fingernails and a dog that would not drink and a paper of poison hidden in a stranger's trunk. And the courtroom was so silent, you could hear the spring wind at the windows. Silas never lost his composure, not even at the end, not even when the sentence came down. He smiled his warm, rueful smile at the judge as they let him out. "Some men are hollow all the way down," Granny Finch had said, "and there's no bottom to find. And don't you spend your life looking for one." Adeline did not look for one. She watched them take him away, and she felt no triumph, only a deep and final sorrow for Gideon, who had lost a brother, once to murder and once to the gallows, and who stood beside her in the courtroom and did not weep, but held her hand so hard it ached. Cyrus Vane's empire came apart that same season, the bank and the freight line and the bought-up newspaper, all of it unwinding, once the fear of him was gone, and the valley that had bowed to him for 20 years stood up straight again. And if there is a lesson in that, it is one that does not wear out with the telling that the powerful are only powerful so long as the frightened stay quiet, and that it sometimes takes only one person who will not stay quiet, one stranger with a black spoon who keeps asking why. The seasons turned over the Hale place the way they always had, but warmer, now fuller. The ranch came back. Adeline kept the books with Eli, the two of them, at the long table where the wedding supper had been honest columns in a clean hand, and the timber money stayed in the timber, and the cattle money stayed in the cattle, and slowly the hole Silas had torn in the place healed over the way a wound heals when you finally get the poison out and let the body do its work. Eli was never the frightening one again, not in that house. The hands had seen him ride for the marshal and bring the neighbors down the mountain, and the story spread the way stories do. And the scarred, quiet man who had stood guard over a poisoned family for a year alone and mistrusted became at last what he had always been under the fear, which was the most loyal soul in that whole high country. He took over the running of the cattle. He stood up at no one's wedding and danced at no one's dance that was not his way. But he was family now, fully openly, and Pearl adored him. And on summer evenings you could find him on the porch, whittling a horse, a bird, a leaping fish, lining them up on the rail for the child the way another man might say the things he could not say. And Pearl grew. The frightened child who had held her sister's sleeve all the way across a continent put down roots in that mountain soil and shot up like a weed in good ground, brown and laughing and fearless. The whole ranch her kingdom, every room of the house hers to run wild in. But the two she'd been warned of, and she minded those two still, because a Hale keeps a deal. She called Gideon Pa before the first summer was out. It happened by itself the way the best things do. He had lifted her onto a horse and was leading her around the corral, and she was shrieking with joy, and she called out, "Pa, look at me. Pa, just like that," like she'd been saying it all her life. And Gideon Hale, who had spent 30 years trying to earn one soft word from a hard man and never got it stopped dead in the middle of the corral, and had to put his face against the horse's neck for a moment, and Adeline, watching from the rail, understood that the child had just given him free and easy the thing his whole family had withheld, and that some debts the heart carries get paid in the most unlooked-for ways. They were married again that summer. Properly this time. Not a hurried ceremony in a snowbound parlor between two strangers, but a real one in the green meadow above the house with the wildflowers out, and the neighbors all come up from the valley, the same hard men who had sat their horses on the ridge, and Mrs. Hollis cried the good kind of tears for once, and Pearl threw flower petals with such violence that half of them went straight up Doc Pruitt's nose, and Gideon and Adeline said vows they had written themselves plain and true, and chosen with open eyes two partners, two equals who had walked through the valley of the shadow together and come out the far side still holding on. And the old silver spoon, her mother's spoon, the one that had gone black in a dying man's cup and started the whole long fight. Adeline polished it back to bright. It took some doing, but she worked at it through a long evening by the fire, the same way she worked at everything patient steady, refusing to quit. And the black came off at last, and the old silver shone worn thin and lovely, and she did not put it away in a drawer like a bad memory. She used it. She used it to feed her own first child a year on a fat, laughing boy with his father's dark eyes, born in that same house in the deep of another winter, with Granny Finch herself there to catch him and Eli, wearing a path in the hall outside, and Pearl appointed very seriously to mind the cat. Adeline fed that healthy crowing baby his first taste of milk and mashed apple off the bright bowl of her mother's spoon, the same spoon by the same hearth where a man had once fallen poisoned, and there was a kind of justice in that too, the deepest kind, the kind that does not come from a courtroom. Because the thing that had been meant for death, she had turned with her own two hands, and a whole winter of refusing to look away into a thing for life. That was the truest victory. Not the trial, not the verdict. That. Gideon found her there one evening, the baby fed and sleeping on her shoulder, the firelight gold on the both of them, the bright spoon in her hand, and he stood in the doorway a moment, the way he always had, too big for it, looking at his family, this thing he had never thought to have. This warmth. He had built a wall of stone to live without, and gotten anyway in the end, by being just barely brave enough to tell the truth one time. He did not say anything. He was still not a man of many words out loud. He did not have to be. She knew. She had learned to read him the way she read everything, not by what was said, but by what was done. And what he did was cross the room and sit beside her, and put his arm around the both of them, his wife and his son, and rest his rough cheek against her hair and breathe. Outside, the snow came down soft over the mountains. The same snow, the same mountains, beautiful and cold and endless. But inside by the fire, it was warm, and the door was unlocked, and she had chosen with her eyes wide open to stay.